I think so. Youri is recording the call.
Okay, perfect. All righty. Well, everybody, welcome to 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. And I am so happy that we are joined by a very special guest, Cindy Sheehan, who is a legendary anti-war activist and anti-imperialist thinker. And, well, so much to talk about, so we're going to dive into it. Cindy, thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
It's a pleasure, and in case for people who are new to anti-war activism and anti-imperialism, as well as people who were lucky to have missed the entire Bush administration, can just briefly explain to people who you are and how you got involved in the in the anti-war movement.
Okay, so my son Casey, my oldest son Casey, was killed in Iraq on April 4th, 2004. And even though I was against the wars, I was against Afghanistan and Iraq. And of course, I was against George Bush, never voted for him. Casey was also against the wars too, but he was in the Army. He joined in 2000. So when he was ordered to go, he felt there was very little he could do to not go. But anyway, after Casey was killed, I started got fired from my job, so I had lots of time to start reaching out, investigating. I started writing articles about the lies of the war and about how it felt to have a child killed because of the war. So I got a little bit of notoriety doing that. And then on August 6, 2005, about 16 months after Casey was killed, I went to Crawford, Texas, and where George Bush had his vacation ranch. It was a small town called Crawford. And I was doing this action to walk up to the checkpoint of the ranch and ask him for a meeting, because he said that our troops died for a noble cause. So I wanted to ask him what was that noble cause. And we were stopped, and I said, well, I'm just going to sit here by the side of the road until George Bush decides to meet with me. And he never did, but it grew into this huge camp called Camp Casey, named after my son. Thousands of people came from really around the world to camp with us, or just be there for a day. Or some people one day came, they drove from Wisconsin, and they said they just wanted to meet me and say hi, and then they got in their car and drove back. So, thousands of people came to Texas, tens of thousands of people around the world did solidarity actions to, my original question, what noble cause, I think was a good rallying cry. But of course, our demands were to end the wars. And because George Bush couldn't answer, there's no noble cause for wars. And so that's basically when I started being, very active in the anti-war, anti-imperialist movement.
And was that and if memory serves me well, I think that was sort of one of the major direct actions against Bush since the invasion of Iraq, because there were these global mass protests against the impending invasion of Iraq, but sadly, unless you can correct me if I'm wrong, but sadly it seemed as if the protests died very quickly after the invasion of Iraq. There was a lot of people feeling demoralized because they felt that we failed in stopping the invasion of Iraq, so, and then some unfortunately got sucked into party politics of, okay, well, let's just join whatever political party is going to claim that they're going to stop the war. But I remember being very young and watching coverage of your protests against Bush and trying to get a meeting with him, and that was sort of one of the first major protests that were starting to pick up again, right after
right. Well, I think you're correct. There were very I between the time my son was killed until Camp Casey, 16 months. I did go around the country to different peace groups, anti-war groups. The rallies were very small. The only big rallies that we actually attended, and this was before Camp Casey, so this was in October, November of 2004. They were anti-Bush rallies because it was the election, right? And so these people were against Bush, but they were in favor of Kerry. And I was never really in favor of Kerry because, Kerry basically said when he got the nomination, the war's not wrong. We haven't been smart about it. So we have to fight it smarter. And so, but then after the invasion, you're right. I think a lot of people did feel demoralized because there were millions of people around the world who went out in opposition to it. Most governments, the bigger powers allied with the United States against the small country of Iraq. But also, I think a lot of people thought now that our troops are there, we can't protest it because we will be seen as not supporting the troops. And so that was, I think, one of the important things about my participation in it, to start telling people it's okay because my son was a troop. And so we had just besides me and my organization, Gold Star Families for Peace, we had military families speak out come, and they had loved ones that were in the military. Most of them were deployed either to Iraq or Afghanistan. But we also had this young organization called, oh my God, Iraq Veterans Against the War, who came out. And so this showed people that, hey, there's troops that are protesting it. There's family members of troops. There are family members whose military loved one died in the war protesting it. So maybe it's okay if we protest it.
So in a way, you helped break a silence to military families, or people, or not even really military families, but people whose kids were in the army, that you can speak out against this war, or you can speak out against any imperial war. You don't have to just sit idly by and just take orders, just because a commander in chief, any commander in chief says, okay, we're going to this country for, for whatever are the false reasons that, that people are sold, right?
Right, and the thing is, after 9/11, it became very traitorous to speak out against the government, where before that, it's not like the government really listened to us anyway, but I don't think we had much of a feeling that what we were doing was wrong, or that we would be punished for exercising our First Amendment rights. But after 9/11, that became different. And so many people started to be afraid of it. And also, the people who were protesting the entry into Iraq, a lot of them were not against the U.S. going into Afghanistan because, they believed that somehow Afghanistan had something to do with 9/11 and that was justified. But of course, since then, we've come to find out that no, and it was so fast. It was like, okay, 9/11 happened on 9/11, 2001, but by October 20th, around there, the U.S. was already invading Afghanistan, so there wasn't much time to think. And a lot of anti-war protesters didn't want to be tarnished with the thing of being against the troops, because there's a lot of myths after Vietnam that the troops came home and hippies were spitting on them and stuff like that, which there's no documented incidents of that actually happening. And so then it's okay, I think, that we can say, me as a socialist, we can say that there are some very compelling socioeconomic reasons for our young people to join the military, because there's nothing else for them. There's no good jobs. There's education is super expensive. prohibitively expensive. And I just am reading an article today that since the economy is so terrible, the Army is gearing up to have a recruitment drive, a push for recruitment, and here in the United States. And that's very frightening, because none of the wars that we got into when Bush was president ended. As a matter of fact, Barack Obama expanded them and destroyed other countries and expanded the war of terror, I call it, into other countries. But now the imperial rhetoric against Venezuela, against China, against Iran is very, very frightening. So I don't think you need a lot of troops unless you're planning some more nefarious imperial wars.
And before we get into why, and because that's a theme I definitely want to talk with you about today, is the people who claim to be anti-war when really they're selectively anti-war, selectively anti-imperialist. But before we get into that, George W. Bush has been on my mind because because there seems to be a push to completely rebrand him and rewrite history because people are suffering from Trump derangement syndrome. So the first question I wanted to ask you is if you can assess the legacy of George W. Bush and explain why people shouldn't make stupid comments like "I miss George Bush" just because they're suffering from Trump derangement syndrome, and Ellen DeGeneres for some reason feels that she can have barbecues and football games with him.
Right. So the legacy of the Bush administration, I think, is a very, personally, very awful. He got the United States mired into two wars that are still happening, Iraq and Afghanistan, and so that millions of people are either dead, displaced. The children are still dying or of depleted uranium, other toxins that the U.S. military leave or bring to a country. It's just a very horrible legacy. And not only that, is that he took a lot of powers upon himself that Barack Obama and Donald Trump are still using. The authorization to use military force against Afghanistan is what they always use. They say we don't have to go to Congress to get a constitutional vote on war because we have this authorization to use military force to combat terrorism. And so they can make anything terrorism, and they can use the AUMF. And he was not, by any stretch of the imagination, he wasn't a smart person. He did many things in this country that made the country worse. When he was leaving office, there was a terrible economic downturn, Wall Street crisis. And so, I just think that his legacy, I can't even list many ways his legacy is really awful. And then I think the rehabilitation of his image, really, Ellen DeGeneres has something to do with it, but it really started with Michelle Obama. And Michelle Obama, she loves George Bush. They're really good friends. They got together doing things with presidents and first ladies and ex-presidents and ex-first ladies, and they went to a funeral. I forget whose funeral it was, but she was coughing, so he handed her a cough drop. So, she accepted it. They sit together, they giggle a lot whenever they go places, and she has admitted that she actually loves him. And so the dangerousness of that legacy is that, remember when Barack Obama was running for president, it might have even been when he was running for the nomination in 2008, somebody asked him, will you investigate and prosecute the lies of the Bush administration that led to Iraq and Afghanistan. By that time, I don't think there was a question in many people's minds about those wars never should have been fought. And I'll take credit for a lot of that happening, the perception changing. So he said, no, we're not going to investigate Bush and Cheney because we have to look forward. We can't look back, we have to look forward. And so looking back on American history, there's no president that doesn't have massive amounts of blood on his hands, right?
Yeah.
And so when you have guaranteed immunity from prosecution from your next, your predecessor, because your predecessor wants that same professional courtesy to commit war crimes and crimes against humanity with no accountability attached to it at all. So there's no accountability. And you're right, just because we have this president now, Donald Trump, I'm not a Republican, but I'm also not a Democrat. I don't approve of Trump. I don't approve of his handling of our current situation. I don't approve of his... The only difference between Trump and Obama, though, is that Obama was a smoother talker, much more, more brains than Trump has. But that's the dangerousness of Trump to the ruling class, because he just blurts stuff out, right? And he doesn't care. Nobody can say anything about Trump because he doesn't care. He'll just go against that person, say whatever he wants to say, whatever he does. So I can't wait until Biden and Trump have debates, by the way, because Trump he'll just eat Biden for lunch when that happens. But anyway, so I think that, that when Obama became president, saying that we're going to look backwards, I reserve the right as commander-in-chief to, have my finger hovering over the nuclear button, Iran, Russia, whatever, it doesn't matter. And then when he won the Nobel Peace Prize, he basically said the same thing. Well, thanks, but, I'm president of the country, and the security of my country is foremost, and I'm still going to do what I have to do, So I think that there's like I said, there's no clean legacy of any president, but since 9/11, this country has changed so much. And the Patriot Act was put into, authorized during the Bush administration, reauthorized every year, right? Which gives the state so much power over our lives. And now that the Patriot Act and the people in the United States were like, oh, well, it's to keep us safe. They're just keeping us safe. And, even though it was definitely a severe violation of the Bill of Rights, at least, now they're able to say, oh, you have to stay at home. We're closing all these businesses. It doesn't matter if you've been if you've owned this business for 40 years and it's your life's work or whatever, and we're just gonna, you can't open it. And if you do open it, we'll arrest you or fine you every day. Just so many things are happening where people are just to me, it's if you're gonna close my business, or if you're gonna say I can't go to work, then you better pay me every penny I'm losing, right? Right? It's my livelihood. And so then when they say it's okay to reopen, then these people haven't lost everything, and then they can safely reopen. So there's just so much happening where the people of the United States are just complacent. Maybe since Barack Obama and Michelle Obama say that they love George Bush, maybe people are forgetting, what a horrendous time that was to be alive.
Yeah, it's quite, it is quite shocking, especially when everyone, keeps sort of, they keep saying that you can't, that you can't vote for Republicans because all of these awful wars happen under their watch. But then at the same time, when a Ralph Nader Cynthia McKinney or somebody who was sincerely against those wars, like a Dennis Kucinich or a Mike Gravel comes into power. It's okay, when we meant anyone but Bush, we didn't mean you guys.
Right, right. You know, or even though I'm not a Bernie Sanders fan, and he voted for a lot of the wars and the war funding and stuff like that. So you can't say he was seriously against any of the wars. But Ron Paul, Dennis Kucinich, Mike Gravel, Cynthia McKinney have a long record of voting no, opposing a lot of the wars, and not all of them, but a lot of the wars and the war funding. And they just wanted a smoother talking, more charismatic version of Bush, so the agenda could go on and the opposition would have to stop. The opposition had to stop under Obama, because not only was Obama a Democrat, but Obama was our first Black president, which means that if you opposed him, you were a racist. And I was like, well, how can I be a racist when I voted for
or you were a self-hating Black person. I know I was accused and I know I think me and the folks at Black Agenda Report, I think we were probably all accused of being self-hating Black people.
Absolutely. Man, I was just so grateful for Black Agenda Report because I was like, oh, now they could say that. I know they got a lot of crap too for saying what they're saying, but they certainly couldn't be accused of being racist for saying the things. But I'm like, our foreign policy is so racist. How can I be a racist for wanting those wars to end? And for calling out Obama, who Glenn Ford called the more effective evil, not the lesser evil, but the more effective evil. And boy, was he right. Because most opposition came to a halt when Obama became president.
That's a that's a perfect segue to my next question, which is, why do you think the anti-war, anti-imperialist movement isn't as strong today as it was during World War I or the Vietnam War, or that very brief moments before the invasion of Iraq in 2003, apart from the occasional mass protests that happened in California or DC and New York, and you mentioned Obama, but yeah.
Well, first of all, like I said, before Camp Casey, all of the mass protests were sponsored by organizations like MoveOn.org, and so I worked with MoveOn thinking they were anti-war because I was very new to the movement. And so what they were, though, was channeling the energy of people who opposed the Iraq War into supporting Kerry, who Kerry did not oppose the Iraq War. Mm-hmm. And so I think it really even started to begin back then in 2004. And I was like a maverick. I was like, I don't care who's president. I don't care who's running for president. I don't care if you're a Democrat or a Republican. If you voted for these wars, if you're supporting these wars, then the anti-war movement should oppose you, right? And so I split with MoveOn during Camp Casey in August of 2005 because they came to me demanding that I support this bill in Congress that was so terrible. And our rhetoric at Camp Casey was troops out now. And they wanted me to support a bill that was like troops out eventually. It was one of those benchmark things, Yeah. And so I'm like, we can't support it. Even though Dennis Kucinich, Neil Abercrombie, Ron Paul, and Walter Jones did a bipartisan thing on it. And I was like, it's not strong enough. We can't support it. And so they broke then away from them. But then in 2005, I went to I met with Nancy Pelosi, I met with Barack Obama, I met with Hillary Clinton, I met with every leading Democrat, and a lot of Republicans too met with me. And all the Democrats, they're such lying jerks. They told me right to my face, Cindy, if you help us take back the House in 2006, we'll help you end the wars. And so shame on me, I believed them. And so part of my energy in 2006 was trying to get the Democrats the House back, which happened. And Nancy Pelosi became Speaker of the House. And immediately, the first thing they did was approve more funding. And so organizations like Move On were discouraging anybody in the anti-war movement to oppose that bill, right? Because if you oppose it, you would have to oppose the Democrats. So I think that I found out in 2008, 2009, when Obama became president, I found out even more than I was already suspecting, was that the movement was not anti-war, but it was anti-Bush. And so, but I was like, well, we could be both, because I'm anti-Bush too, right? We can be anti-war and anti-Bush, but no, because how can people who like MoveOn.org or 360.org or I don't know, all the like liberal or big liberal organizations with big lists, like the Daily Kos at the time. I don't even know if they're still a thing. But how could they oppose wars when the Democrats supported them? You know, because I was told in 2008 during that campaign, in March of 2008, we wanted to organize. I was running against Nancy Pelosi at the time.
For Congress?
Huh?
You were running against Nancy Pelosi for Congress?
Yeah.
Okay.
In San Francisco. And so, because she wouldn't impeach George Bush and Dick Cheney. So I ran against her. I came in second. I got like 17% of the vote, which is the highest anybody's done against her.
Nice.
And so anyway, there was still a contest of who was going to be the Democratic nominee, right? And the Republican, because Bush was a lame duck. And so I said, it's the 5th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq. We should have a protest in Washington, D.C. And some organizations were in favor of that. But the leading anti-war organizations that had the big lists, that had the big followings, they said, we cannot have a protest in Washington, D.C. because it would embarrass the Democrats. That was their whole thing. They did not want to embarrass the Democrats in an election year. And so I was like, I had already left the Democrat Party by the time that happened. But I was like, you guys are such frauds. Just stop calling yourself anti-war. Just say that you're just like organizations to elect Democrats. That's fine. But you're just like blowing smoke up people's noses to say that you're anti-war, because it's just false. And so people, especially during Obama, a lot of people were fooled by his campaign. A lot of people didn't care. They just wanted him elected. A lot of people heard things that he never said, you know, because he was never anti-war. He just said he was against going into Iraq because it was a dumb war, a rash war. And so a lot of people truly, I don't really blame them. I blame the whole electoral industrial complex and blame the fact that the anti-Bush sentiment was rightfully there was no Republican that was going to win that year anyway. And so then Obama comes. One of the first things he does as president is order drone bombing in northern Afghanistan that killed dozens of people. And so people told me during this whole time, Cindy, we just got to get Obama in there. And then once we get him in there, we can hold his feet to the fire. And so he was inaugurated on Tuesday. Friday, he dropped a drone bomb, killing, dozens of people. It was on a wedding party, And so I put something out going, it didn't take very long to become a presidential war criminal. And this was way before Facebook or whatever. This was to my email list. Unsubscribe, 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 unsubscribe. And people were furious with me. They were saying, Cindy, you have to give him a chance. And I'm like, you're mad at me because he killed innocent people? And I pointed it out. I said, you're the same stupid person that told me, let's get him in and then we'll hold his feet to the fire. But now you're telling me, let's give him a chance. No, you don't give murderers a chance to do more murder. So this is the reason, that people who are liberal, people who would tend to vote Democrat, people who would tend to be against the wars, they're more about partisan politics than they are about principles.
Yeah.
Was that answer too long?
No. I think that I completely agree with you, and I think that perfectly explains it. And then before I get to my next question, do you think did a lot of the left-leaning media also play a huge part in deceiving their viewers or their readers about Obama? Because you talked about the rise of Obama and how so many people who supposedly were anti-war and what's broadly called the liberal left are just smelling their own bullshit when they say that you have to give Obama a chance, and Obama, he is a flaming left-winger. He's only playing a moderate. He's only playing a centrist because that's how you get elected and all that jazz.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And do you think, and that's a perfect segue into, why do you think there isn't the same level of protest against the Western Gulf destruction of Syria as there is for Yemen? Because there seems to be a kind of unworthy victim amongst many on the left, in which many, decry what's going on in Yemen and denounce what's going on in Yemen. But on Syria, completely different story. And then also, you see people going into the streets protesting against, the murder of the Iranian general and against any impending, war with Iran. But not the same when it comes to Venezuela, which is a war, which is a war for oil. And why do you think that is? Why do you think so many on the left have that are selectively anti-war as opposed to consistently anti-war?
Well, there's a thing that I think that they're falling for the propaganda. It's like Assad is a bad guy. Maduro is a bad guy. They're both evil dictators, right? And so we shouldn't be. I think opposite of those two things, especially with Maduro, especially with Venezuela. I have a long association with Venezuela. But it shouldn't really matter it shouldn't matter who is leading a country. Our anti-imperialist principle should be the U.S. should not meddle in sovereign states, and that's imperialism. So I think that I see this actually all the time. There's one person that even has a website called Anti-Imperialism, but he's against Assad. So we've been called the Putin left. Anybody who doesn't believe Russiagate, or anybody who doesn't think that Putin is like as gross as our leaders. We're on the Putin left, or they've even like called
the Putin left. I've heard of useful idiots for Russia, but I never heard that term, the Putin left. That's interesting.
And I think that's part of what is going on. Is I see a lot of so-called anti-war organizations, especially around Venezuela, saying Maduro has to go, but there should be no U.S. meddling. So they list all these reasons that Maduro needs to not be president of Venezuela. But I'm like, if this is really the person he is, then we should be supporting him being taken out as president of Venezuela, right? Because he sounds like a real horrible, person, almost as bad as like a Trump or a Bush or an Obama. But so that's not the way anti-imperialists should be anti-imperialist. If you happen to think that the leader is bad, you should keep that to yourself. I happen to think any leader that the U.S. is demonizing is a leader that we should not participate in that demonization, because they're only demonizing those leaders to overthrow them, go to war with them, sponsor coups against them, like just happened 6 months ago in Bolivia with Evo Morales. So I think that's part of the reason. And I also I wonder sometimes, it's like so many people on the left are very against Israel, and they're against the occupation of Palestine, which I am also. But so this is a big issue. But then not so much Yemen, and so Saudi Arabia and Israel have a lot to do with what's happening in Yemen. So I don't understand either, is how we can pick and choose which interventions. I know that there's so much U.S. intervention that we can't really all be 100% focused on all of them all the time. But, that's just a very interesting question. I think the people who are actually pro-imperialism, who participate in demonizing leaders, that's one thing, but as anti-war, anti-imperialists, we have to be 100% against, U.S. intervention into other countries without question.
Yeah, I find it also astounding that you have so many people who, as you mentioned, are passionately for ending the occupation of Palestine and bringing nationhood to Palestine, which is a very noble cause. And of course, you take a lot of flack for, legitimately speaking out against Israel, but yet when it comes to Syria, they're so viciously for Western imperialism in Syria, and are ready to smear you or even kick you out of the Palestine solidarity movement just because you're rightly speaking out against Syria as being just yet another Western imperial project.
Well, I think a lot of it has to do also with one thing I was going to mention, is these phony color revolutions, these phony uprisings that are sponsored by U.S. or Israel-funded NGOs. And that happened in Ukraine. And so and that happened under Obama. So now we're supposed to believe that Russia is evil. Russia had invaded Ukraine, that the U.S. was sponsoring the revolution because that Russian overreach into Ukraine and things like that. So if you're like an Obama supporter, you're going to think that what he and Clinton, or was it Kerry at the time?
Obama president, Biden VP, and Hillary Clinton secretary of state. I think she was still the secretary of state when that happened.
There are representatives there, Victoria Nuland and things like that. You're going to believe that was a real people's revolution instead of a phony NGO U.S. supported overthrow. And I can't remember the president's name. It wasn't a great guy, but he wasn't a terrible person either. And so he wasn't as friendly to U.S. interests as the other person coming up. And that's why they want to overthrow Maduro. They want to, believe that they can install a legitimate president who nobody in Venezuela wants as president, not even his own party, Guaido, and that, things are going to be better for them and for the oil companies. And what's happening in Iran has a lot to do with oil also, because Iran controls the Straits of Hormuz, and that's where the big tankers have to go in and out of.
And you mentioned NGOs, and how much do you think NGOs have played in making Western left-leaning people selectively anti-war, and them jumping the shark for you already mentioned Venezuela, but explain how those NGOs managed to make those people into yeah, into supporting, even the coup in Bolivia, where many people were also saying, well, Evo Morales, he was starting to become a communist dictator, and he was also not environmentally friendly, so therefore oust the guy, as well, of course, the protests going on in Hong Kong.
Right. Well, I think that what happens is like the national, I can't even think of
National
U.S.
Endowment for Democracy.
Right, and USAID. I was going to combine them into NEAID. They identify people who they can work with in these countries, like you said, the Hong Kong protests, the beginning of Syria, Egypt, Ukraine, Venezuela. They pour tens of millions of dollars of USAID, NED, CIA pour tens of millions of dollars into these movements to help destabilize the government. And so people look at those movements like they called Evo Morales anti-imperialist. Well, look at that. Greta Thunberg was supporting the ouster of Evo Morales because he was anti-environmentalist. So when you look at those kinds of things, people think that they are legit protesting, or they're legit protests or protesters, and they're not. They are sponsored by the United States. And that came into being because of Latin America, the NED, because of the Iran-Contra thing, where, it came to light that, yes, the U.S. was funding the opposition. And so it became, there was like laws passed against doing it. So to get around it, they started the National Endowment for Democracy. That just sounds so benign, doesn't it? We're endowing democracy. What's better than democracy? And it's an endowment. We're not trying to overthrow anybody, but they've used it very, very good, not only in those countries, but then they use the mass media here to enforce the propaganda.
And do you find that's also happened with a lot of the nonprofits, left-leaning media in not just the U.S. but elsewhere, but like in the U.S., like for example, like Democracy Now! Has been painting the situation in Syria as moderate rebels fighting against the evil Assad regime, and of course many people they keep depicting Maduro as this communist dictator that needs to be overthrown. And because I think a lot of them read reports from Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and so forth, many of them they'll say, hey, I'm not for Western imperialism, but we do need to support ousting Maduro, Morales, Assad, or even Putin, and supporting the protests in Hong Kong, right?
Right. Well, I think that they play a big role, and just remember, Amnesty International promoted the whole thing in the Gulf War of Iraqi troops taking babies out of incubators in Kuwait and just throwing them on the ground and things like that. So it plays Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch. They sound like they're doing good things, and once in a while they're not bad, But a lot of times they do support the propaganda that's like 100% false. So that's when other organizations that maybe don't work in foreign countries, but work for human rights here, or peace, or for other social causes, they look at them for guidance, and so they're getting bad guidance because they're also supported by questionable funds. I mean, Amy Goodman, Democracy Now! are supported by questionable grants and funding. So we have to look at that before we take these media outlets with any kind of legitimacy. We have to look at their funding, look at their sources, but it's always like sometimes they get things right. So when they get things wrong, but not too wrong. I don't know if I'm making any sense, but if they're
No.
the same things as AI or HRW or MSNBC, which everybody knows is liberal, so they must be right too. So if they're like kind of reporting, they're kind of in sync, then and people don't look too deeply.
Do you find that's the same thing with Qatari-funded media like Al Jazeera, Middle East Eye, and Middle East Monitor, in which again, they might do very great stuff on Palestine, great stuff on Yemen, but when it comes to Syria and some of these color revolutions that happened in Egypt and Lebanon, they've managed to just make people jump the shark that, okay, that's the war we need to support, and that's a people-powered revolution we need to support.
Yeah, I used to be a paid columnist for Al Jazeera until they moved to Qatar, and then their funding, I guess, became different, and they started, because I think that they used to be really, really good, and then they started to be compromised, I think, because of the funding that they're getting.
Damn shame. And then that being said, which outlets or which news outlets or organizations do you recommend any anti-imperialist, whether they're on the left or the right? Because I know that some libertarians, can be anti-imperialist. Which organizations would you suggest an anti-war activist, read or even join if they want to stop seeing all of these corrupt, endless wars?
Well, there's one that's been around since 2009. I would really recommend. That's called Cindy Sheehan Soapbox, and I've had a blog. I've had a blog and a podcast since then. It would be 100% anti-imperialist. You won't find anything on there that is supporting any propaganda or demonizing any leaders of other countries. Black Agenda Report. We already mentioned that. I think there's this newish outlet called Mint Press News that is very good.
Yeah. Fantastic outlets. I know you've interviewed Whitney Webb, and I had her as a previous guest as well.
She's not with them anymore, unfortunately. But Manar Muhawish, a Palestinian American, is the editor in chief of Mint Press News. They're really good. Telesur from Venezuela is very. I'm just always tired of reading negative articles about Cuba and Venezuela. You can't find anything positive, but usually from here. So things like that. RT, Sputnik, is questionable sometimes, but there's not, except for a few, there's not any that I trust 100%. There are a few that I do trust, close to 100%. So I just recommend that we become very smart, selective consumers of news. And so even if Black Agenda Report is one of my most trusted, it's mostly commentary, but I haven't seen anything where they've made a claim or whatever that's been false. But even if you trust a site, you should try to go to other trusted places and verify it. Just do your own research and find out. I know who not to trust. Don't trust CNN or MSNBC or Fox or things like that. But just be a really good consumer of news. And I actually have stopped almost completely reading any newspapers or magazines or whatever. I usually go to my Facebook wall and go down my Facebook wall and read articles from that. That's what I do. I take my coffee and just read articles from. I get the emails from the organizations that I talked about, and I read those every morning also. But there's so much choice now. When I first started, there were very few online trustworthy places, and everybody trusted Amy Goodman in Democracy Now! At that point, right? So, but she's been shown, like you said, to be compromised on on several issues, especially when Obama was president. Oh my gosh, I spoke on a panel with Amy shortly after Obama was inaugurated, and I really thought she was going to pee her pants. She was so happy and just like, oh, Obama, and his. We remember when he took the train from Chicago to Washington. It was just like Lincoln. I'm like, I just like was on the panel looking at her going, what?
Wow. Wow.
And I spoke after her, so I was just like, I never write a speech. Everybody else writes speeches. I'm always inspired by what other people said. And I'm like, I sure hope that he's like some kind of second coming of an ideal that has never been ideal here in the United States. Like some kind of first coming of this peace president that's going to bring peace. Like if Obama was like half as great as Obama thought he was, he would have been an amazing president. And I said, I hope that's true. And and it was a Muslim organization. So they were all like, yay, Obama. And I was like, oh my God, and unfortunately I proved it to be right, and she proved to be like smoking tobacco.
But that's crazy that so many people drunk the Obama Kool-Aid when you would think that these anti-war, that these supposedly left-leaning outlets and these anti-war organizations, I mean, you would think that that if they were going to prop up anyone, it would have been Dennis Kucinich or Mike Gravel, because they really did have a left reformist agenda at home and an anti-imperialist agenda abroad, and yet they were completely ignored by the Democracy Nows of the world, the Nations of the world, the Daily Kos of the world, and this boring centrist Obama was propped up as this anti-war flaming left winger when he wasn't either or.
Well, look, even in the general election that year of 2008, there was Cynthia McKinney, who I supported, who I voted, and Ralph Nader was running as an independent, and Cynthia McKinney was running as a Green. So instead of compromising, well, it's all about funding. If Amy supported the Green Party or supported an independent candidate, then a lot of her liberal funding is going to dry up. So I don't have to worry about that because I don't really get that much funding. So I could just be as outspoken, and I can always adhere to my principles, which is a really good place to be.
Well, one final question I wanted to ask you was, can you talk about going back to the first question, the Bush legacy and the devastating tool his policies had on you and your family? Can you talk about why some of the families who were sent to the war and who had families who fought in the Iraq War, which was clearly based on massive deception, why do they accept George Bush into their house and he paints pictures of their kids and even accepts money that he's going to make from a book that he's going to donate to helping them out?
I wrote an article about that, actually. He paints, and doesn't paint very good portraits, but he paints portraits of wounded soldiers. Some of them are just horribly maimed, and I don't understand it. I seriously don't understand it. There must be this desire. I know it comes from I've met a lot of mothers whose children were killed in Iraq or Afghanistan. I mean, even Vietnam, I've met some mothers a long time ago when Casey was first killed. And Vietnam, I mean, what other proof does anybody need that was an absolute disaster based on lies? Millions of Vietnamese killed, 65,000 U.S. Now more Vietnam vets have killed themselves than were actually killed in the war, more than double. And so that was an absolute disaster. I think there's a desire to think that your child wasn't maimed or wasn't killed for lies, that there was something noble about it. And so, or that you weren't. You know, I didn't lose my legs for a lie. I lost my legs because I was in Iraq and I was liberating the Iraqi people, and I was, making sure that Americans were safe. So I think that it's that desire, and I'm only speaking of people who lost somebody in the war, or who was maimed or seriously injured because of the war. You know, this desire that I don't want to know that my child died for a lie, when I knew that all along. I knew that even before Casey was killed. I told his sister after he had been deployed, I said, if Casey dies, it's going to be for nothing. It's going to be for shit, And so I went on a TV show before I was well known, and it was a local news show that invited about, I would say, 15 families. So that was usually the mother and father, the stepmother, father, the stepdad or mother of local people, local soldiers who have been killed in Iraq. And most of the other parents were like, oh, if my son didn't die, I know I'd be wearing a burqa right now. Just kind of stupid things like that. And I just stood up and I said, I am sorry, but I oppose this war. I opposed it before Casey went. I oppose it now. And if having my son here meant I would have to wear a burqa, guess what? I would wear a burqa. But that's not what this war was about. This war was about oil. This war was about resource control. And then so after I spoke my piece, and it was in San Francisco, so, I wasn't way out there, even though the mother who said that about the burqa, she came from like Fresno or something. And so afterwards, they had psychologists there for us to speak to. So if it brought like any big emotions up, then the psychologists were there. And I had to go straight from that little town hall meeting to an interview. Like CNN or somebody rented a room that they could interview me. And so I did that. And so most of the parents were gone except for me when I came in, and my husband at the time. And all of the psychologists came up to me, because all of the other parents were gone, and they said, you know what? The way you think is hard right now, but in the long run, it's going to be much easier for you because you've already accepted that hard truth. And they said, what we've seen is these parents who believe their child died for something good, they're going to realize one of these days that that's not the truth, and it's going to be so much harder for them right now. So I think that's what's going on, is they think it's easier to believe their child is a hero, but I think we just have to redefine hero, right? And Casey was reported many times that day saying, I can never kill anybody. No, I'm not going on that mission. I'm just a mechanic. I don't want to kill anybody. But he was forced to go and he died. So I'm thinking, maybe the way they lived their lives, we should say that's heroic, not the way that they were killed or for what they were killed for.
And because do you think the fact that because America is so patriotic, I mean, everyone's always, singing the national anthem, every baseball game, every American football game, at basketball, the Pledge of Allegiance, to the flag. So people are brought up very quick to love the U.S. and think that the U.S. is a force for good in the world, and when a war does happen, and of course, all wars, all wars are bullshit. Wars are racket. But the fact that something like Iraq, where no weapons of mass destruction, were found, no weapons of mass destruction were found, it's just too difficult for some of those military families or some of those families to accept. So they still have, so as you mentioned, they still have to say, well, he at least fought for freedom, and at least Iraq is not under Saddam Hussein, and Bush was not an evil guy. He was just misguided and whatnot.
They don't think he was misguided. They think he was like some kind of a hero for doing what he did. And I just want to say, like, I don't know how old you are, but I went through like elementary school and junior high in the heart of the worst part of the Vietnam War, and so we saw the protests, we saw the devastation happening in Vietnam on a nightly basis. There was so much disenchantment with this country from so many people. Then Nixon was impeached, so there was no confidence in America, and nobody would even think of flying an American flag. It wasn't like that this big of a thing. And yeah, we sang the national anthem before baseball games, but we didn't sing God Bless America in the seventh inning stretch. We sang Take Me Out to the Ball Game, and we were so bored with a Star Spangled Banner or whatever, yay, And but then 9/11 happens, and everybody's plastering like flags all over. And so 9/11 was a seminal, like, I'm not saying that it didn't happen, because it obviously happened, but I'm saying that what the establishment tells us what happens is what happened. But it just led these people into this feverish, this fever of fear. Could it happen again? Could it happen in Bakersfield? Could Al-Qaeda come, and could they force that mother to wear a burqa? I mean, people were so afraid that, that many people believed that, yeah, Saddam had something to do with 9/11. Yeah, Afghanistan, we need to, to invade Afghanistan. And they believed that that was keeping America safe. So, and now they can look and say, see, we haven't had any terrorist attacks since then. So, it must have been the right path to take, which of course, was a little tiny analysis shows that that's not right. So anyway, since 9/11, yeah, it's been very unpatriotic to question the government. It's been very unpatriotic to, question the troops, question the military, and to display this, like, just because you put up a flag doesn't mean that you're patriotic or a good person. And then when all that flag stuff happened, and you're just look at the flag I have back there. It's a peace flag. You put this flag up, I call it the bloody rag of empire. So when you put the flag up, what does it symbolize? It symbolizes occupation, death, destruction, capitalism, imperialism. So to me, it doesn't represent anything good.
Do you find the American flag is as offensive as the Confederate flag?
Yes, both. I'm like, hey, if they're going to take down statues of Robert E. Lee, they should take down statues of George Washington. They should especially take statues down of Andrew Jackson. Because this whole system is racist.
Yeah, I have a friend of mine, Robert Eggington, who's a member of the Noongar, Aboriginal tribe in Australia, and he once said about the Australian flag, that I do not recognize the Australian flag. It's a butcher's apron. And I always think to myself, I do support, removing Confederate flags and all of those, and all those races, but George Washington and all of those guys, and even Abe Lincoln, they're just rival racists and rival imperialists. And if you're going to take down the Confederate flag because you think that's a symbol of white supremacy, well, the American flag, I would also say maybe we need to get a new flag.
Hello, ding dong. I agree. I agree.
And then
I just think that people who still insist on displaying the Confederate flag, I think they might be a little more scary than the people who display the American flag. To this day, if they still insist on displaying the Confederate flag, there's just something wrong with that person.
I completely agree with you.
I mean, it's a white supremacist system. And it always has been that way, from the slaughter of our native people to black slavery to fighting a war that kills almost 700,000 people to end it, instead of just ending it because it was an abomination, like Great Britain finally did before the United States did. Yeah, it's just a terrible system, and there's been more death and destruction under the stars and stripes than the Confederate flag, that's for sure. Even though the Confederate flag is like just creepy and scary.
Completely agree with you. And then one final question before I let you enjoy the rest of your weekend is how should John McCain and George H.W. Bush be truly remembered?
As mass murdering psychopaths. There should be no elevation of every president's a mass murdering psychopath. John McCain is an actual war criminal. So that's one of the problems with this country. We celebrate war criminals. We celebrate mass murderers instead of, we prosecute people like Ted Bundy, who should have been prosecuted, right? But then, like, build monuments to mass murderers.
And do you know how the efforts to free Julian Assange are doing, at least on the ground in the U.S. with the anti-war and anti-imperialist groups, or is it looking very bleak at the moment?
Well, I think a lot of efforts are looking bleak because of this lockup that we're experiencing here. I think my own organization, March on the Pentagon, which just started 2 years ago, anti-imperialist women-led organization, I don't think we're going to survive this, because our main thing is to organize a protest in Washington, D.C. every year, and nobody's can go to Washington, D.C. So I think there's as much as we can do from our homes and getting information out, and just like, why is Julian Assange being persecuted like this when people like George H.W., John McCain, Barack Obama
are lionized?
George W. They have these undeserved good reputation, and the ones who are still living are living these wonderful, American dream lives, when Julian Assange is like literally dying in prison.
Well, here's hoping that the ongoing coronavirus crisis ends soon, so that people can, go back into the streets and feel safe to go back into the streets, because the anti-war movement and the anti-imperial movement, it's not dead, but it certainly it feels like it's in a coma right now, and it really needs to be woken up, and I think people really need to do what you have done, which is also call out people who claim to be on the left, but the moment they start jumping the shark on the next imperial adventure, they need to be called out, because that can only strengthen the movements.
Mm-hmm. Well, we just need to keep doing what we're doing and do the best we can.
And if people want to check out your website where you host a radio show, where can they find it? Where can they find it?
Cindy Sheehan Soapbox .blogspot.com. But I think if you just put Cindy Sheehan Soapbox, you'll get directed to it. I'm on Facebook. I refuse to be on Twitter. Yeah, I barely like being on Facebook, but it's a way of staying connected with people. So just Cindy Sheehan or Cindy Sheehan Soapbox on Facebook.
Well, Cindy, keep doing the great work you're doing, and thank you for being a guest on 1+1. And we hope to have you back in the future as a regular guest. So,
well, thanks for inviting me. I thought this was a really nice conversation.
Likewise. Thank you.